I'm also from SUNY Pueblo in New Mexico. And I'll have my colleagues introduce themselves so you can hear their voices.
Hi, I'm Lori Townsend, and I am the Learning Services Coordinator and Engineering Librarian here at UNM. I'm also a member of the Shoshone-Paiute tribes of Duck Valley.
And I am David Hurley. I'm the Discovery and Web Librarian at University of New Mexico, and I'm a white guy.
And also, just so you all know, we're all in the same room here, and we're going to try really hard to be quiet while each one of us is speaking, but we can't promise we won't laugh and
or make interjections or something.
Yes, so just so you know. And just to give a quick roadmap of the discussion today, first I'll share briefly some information about cultural competence. Then Lori will take us through a discussion of cultural humility. Then David, of humility, I'm sorry. And then David will dig into cultural humility as a concept and how it may fit within our library context. Also, at the end, we'll have a link to a handout with our definitions and the articles we're citing for your reference later. So just so you know, that'll be available. And so why don't we go ahead and jump right in here. So, cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, diversity training, cultural competence, and now cultural humility. There are many ways to get at the same ideas, and it can seem like these are just different words that mean the same thing. And it's true that they're sometimes used interchangeably by people and in the literature, yet words matter, and these phrases do not refer to the same concepts. It's also true that some of the ideas we're presenting today as cultural humility, which we'll define in a few minutes, can be found in some formulations of cultural competence as well. So today, we want to make the case that cultural humility is both distinct from cultural competence and more suited for most library contexts. So to start with some background, where did the concept of cultural competence emerge from? Social worker Terry L. Cross and his colleagues at Georgetown University articulated the first definition of the theory. Cultural competence services to patients from diverse backgrounds, which are often different than the service provider. The concept is widely researched and utilized by the nursing, social work, counseling, and education fields who have each come up with their own definitions similar to this original. Similarly, libraries are service organizations, and we have incorporated the concept of cultural competency into our professional standards and practices. For example, in 2012, ACRL published cultural competency standards for academic libraries with specific outcomes for individual employees, library administrators, and the organization as a whole. The frequently cited 2009 article by Dr. Patricia Montiel-Overall advocates for the use of cultural competence as a framework for libraries. She identifies actions librarians can take to demonstrate knowledge along a cultural competence continuum, which is based on a model proposed by Cross. And there are advantages to employing cultural competency as a framework to provide relevant services and collections to library patrons. First, cultural competency is grounded in our existence within a diverse society and the perception that knowing how to interact with people different from you is required for professionals and citizens in that increasingly diverse society. Second, cultural competency recognizes the impossibility of one-size-fits-all service, so providers must learn to customize each interaction to make it meaningful and useful for the patron. Also, strategies to build cultural competence can be useful in certain situations for people to gain a cursory understanding, for instance, if you're preparing to travel to another country. Also, cultural competency can appeal to organizations because competence is a familiar concept in the workplace. Competence is something relatively straightforward that people can achieve through training and education. Indeed, Dr. Lori Mestry found in her review of the library literature that when libraries do not provide cultural competency training, there are negative consequences. She found evidence for the following. Without cultural competency training, library patrons from diverse backgrounds may receive poor service, that librarians may lack a general understanding of cultural differences, and they will not always grasp the many ways a patron's culture may affect their library use. So why question and critically examine cultural competency now that it's widely implemented and used as a framework in libraries? Well, we all read the seminal article on cultural humility by Tervalon and Murray Garcia, which David found while researching another project, and the idea resonated with each of us for different reasons. To share our current context here at UNM, we are a Hispanic serving institution with 41% of our students identifying as Hispanic, the largest percentage of students population by race. And our next largest non-white student population is Native American at 5%. And of course, these are traditionally underserved populations, and we are always searching for strategies to better support our students. Cultural humility seems to be one of those strategies, which we'll get more into in a few minutes. And the concept of cultural humility builds on the advances developed using cultural competence, but we suggest goes further and addresses some of the critiques of cultural competency. And the critiques of cultural competency come from varying fields where the concept has been widely adopted. These critiques are also the reasons we find cultural competency problematic. And in advocating for cultural humility, Fisher-Bourne and colleagues note the following shortcomings of cultural competency in their practice of social work. So cultural competency tends to focus on simply providing access or exposure to other cultures and becoming comfortable around others different than you. There's less focus on the individual recognizing the power imbalance and biases they bring to interactions with clients. And some discussions around cultural competency use the word culture as a shortcut for non-white or people of color, thus assuming white identity as the norm. Also a problem is the focus on race and ethnicity, which ignores the reality of people embodying and being discriminated against due to multiple aspects of their identity, such as gender and sexual orientation. Fisher-Bourne also points out for her, a major fault of cultural competence is the lack of acknowledgement of institutional structures which can stop clients from accessing services. This lack of recognition of power imbalance can imply it's the responsibility of the individual practitioner to actively challenge these structural barriers. So looking at cultural competency from a library perspective, we believe there are areas where the concept doesn't quite fit into our practice. For example, the ACRL standards note that cultural competency can be learned like other skills, implying mastery of ever-changing concepts of culture and identity, which is unrealistic. So now I'll turn the mic over to Lori, who will share some thoughts about humility.
Hi, folks. So humility has gotten a little bit of a bad reputation. In popular culture, the word humility has some negative associations and connotations. Low status, low self-worth, low self-esteem, the underestimation of one's value. It is often a trait associated with religion or the religious. I tend to think of the Pope washing the feet of juvenile delinquents, but in our increasingly secular society, that connotation might prove a barrier to some. And in the active sense of humbling oneself, typically we associate that with submitting oneself to authority or bowing down before someone or something outside of ourselves, which at the very least brings up troubling power dynamics. And what do we think of when we think of a humble person? Is it a person who speaks with confidence, feels good about themselves, is active in the world and seeks to improve it? Depending on your context, you might think it's a really great trait of your closest friends and allies, or that awesome colleague who is always willing to listen, or the marginalized and disenfranchised of society, or those with low self-esteem. This makes the context, the cultural context of humility fraught, and it might make you skeptical. So we're going to start with some basic definitions. So this is an OED definition which defines humility as the quality of being humble or having a lowly opinion of oneself, meekness, lowliness, humbleness, the opposite of pride or haughtiness. And the definition of humble is having a low estimate of one's importance, worthiness, or merits marked by the absence of self-assertion or self-exaltation, lowly, the opposite of proud. No wonder humility looks so unappealing. These aren't exactly things I want to pursue as goals in life. Additionally, social scientists have struggled to study humility in the way that they have other related personality traits, such as self-esteem, narcissism, and modesty. This relates to our distinction between cultural humility and competence in a way that David will talk about later, and it points to the difficulty of assessing humility and interventions related to humility. I think we have an idea of what a humble person looks like, their mien or demeanor, but we don't have a long-used, comfortably valid measure available to quantify that trait. The difficulty measuring humility may also present itself as an aspect of humility. Is it an external or an internal state? An action, a way of presenting oneself, or a way of being, of approaching the world, of how one regards the self in relation to the world? But obviously, we are here today to talk about something other than being humbled and the negative connotations of humility. Let's start with the opposite of humility for a second. Now, you may jump straight to pride, which Sarah and I are going to talk about a bit later, but I'm actually going to take us somewhere a bit more negative. Arrogance, the taking of too much upon one's self as one's right, the assertion of unwarrantable claims in respect of one's own importance, undue assumption of dignity, authority, or knowledge, aggressive conceit, presumption, or haughtiness. I'm not sure, but I think we've all run into this, and it is the opposite of someone who will strive to be culturally competent. And it's a good place to start thinking about what those who possess the trait of humility are not. So what is humility? According to June Price Tangney, in her seminal article, Humility, Theoretical Perspectives, Empirical Findings, and Directions for Future Research, which was written in the year 2000, there are several dimensions of humility, which she terms a neglected virtue. So there's 2 slides, there's 6 dimensions. An accurate assessment of one's abilities and achievements, an ability to acknowledge one's mistakes, imperfections, gaps in knowledge, and limitations, openness to new ideas, contradictory information, and advice, keeping one's abilities and accomplishments, one's place in the world in perspective, a relatively low self-focus, a forgetting of the self, while recognizing that one is but part of the larger universe, an appreciation of the value of all things as well as the many different ways that people and things can contribute to our world. So we're going to focus on a couple of these elements, and they're the ones that we found the most compelling and central to our understanding of the concept of humility. So I'm pretty sure the element that was most surprising initially to us was the word accurate used here. This particular element of humility seems to contradict the OED definitions and our common understanding of humility. Because, I mean, it seems like we were talking about low self-esteem. However, it has been shown again and again that humans tend to overestimate our abilities, to overestimate our positive qualities, and throw shade on others while ignoring our own faults. So perhaps that emphasis on accurate self-knowledge is not surprising. However, it is a bit daunting. I actually prefer another perspective on this element that Peterson and Seligman offer in their book Character Strengths and Virtues. And it further refines it to this: a willingness to see the self accurately rather than the absolute attainment of accuracy. Nonetheless, from our perspective, accuracy is secondary to whether a person is willing and able to weigh information in a non-defensive way. I like this because it speaks to an attitude and a habit of mind rather than a preoccupation with how I see myself. And I think part of the reason why Peterson and Seligman can give accuracy a bit of a shrug, kind of a sure, give it a shot, it's a good thing, is probably that the most important aspect of humility is this: a relatively low self-focus, a forgetting of the self, while recognizing that one is but part of the larger universe. So, sure, be open to being honest with yourself about yourself, but more importantly, we can try to just stop thinking about ourselves so darn much, to hesitate before devoting time worrying about how others see us, how we see ourselves. Sir John Templeton's expression of this phenomenon is becoming unselfed. This doesn't mean that we devalue ourselves, but it means that we shift our attention to others and, to quote Tangney again, our eyes open to the beauty and potential in those around us. It means that we start seeing others as more valuable and our perspective on ourselves shifts accordingly. And when we start noticing the beauty and value of others, we stop worrying about defending our own value. Speaking of woke. True humility is more like self-forgetfulness. It leaves people free to esteem their special talents, and with the same honesty to esteem their neighbors. Both the neighbor's talents and one's own are recognized as gifts, and like one's height, are not fit subjects for either inordinate pride or self-deprecation. So we would summarize the two fundamental features of humility as accuracy, as opposed to modesty or devaluing, and becoming unself in an appreciative and self-reflective way. Encouraging and developing these two habits of mind and self lead to a whole host of associated behaviors. And David's now going to talk about humility in the context of cultural humility.
Okay, so what does it mean to bring humility into this discussion about working with people with backgrounds and experiences different from our own? And why do we think this is potentially very useful for libraries? So we should probably start with a definition of cultural humility, but first I actually want to step back and think about what we're trying to accomplish. So going back to all of those words that Sarah mentioned at the beginning, cultural awareness, cultural sensitivity, diversity training, cultural competence, what's the big idea underlying all of those terms? And essentially, the way I'll phrase it is the idea is to recognize that my norms aren't the only norms, and that doesn't mean that any of them are wrong. And that sounds really simple. And for people who live outside the dominant culture, it may be. But this can also be a really challenging, perspective-shattering idea for people. Even for people who get it in most contexts, there can be new situations or interactions where this idea becomes challenging again. That so many conversations around these ideas are characterized by defensiveness and sometimes aggressive defensiveness highlights how hard this can be. And how do you encourage someone to have this recognition? Like, cultural competency training often includes learning about specific cultural differences. People from culture A tend to be direct. People from culture B find directness rude. People from this culture bow. People from that culture shake hands. But while one can learn that these different norms exist intellectually, I'm not sure that it really has an impact on how people see the world. And here's where we think practicing cultural humility can be useful. So let's define it. So there are a lot of definitions out there, and none of them are perfect. But I like this one from Joshua Hook, and it gets cited frequently. Cultural humility involves the ability to maintain an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented or open to the other in relation to aspects of cultural identity that are most important to the client. So one thing I like about this as a definition is the word involves. Cultural humility involves. This isn't even attempting to be a comprehensive definition. But even so, there's a lot going on here, so let's break it down. So the first part is maintaining an interpersonal stance. So this comes into play when you are interacting with others. So maintaining an interpersonal stance that is other-oriented. Okay, thinking back to humility, one key idea that Lori discussed was this sense of being unselved. One of the concerns I have with cultural competence is it focuses on the self. I am competent in your culture, so I will interact with you effectively. The unselved approach, the cultural humility approach, is to be open to what beliefs, expectations, preconceptions, identities the other person is bringing to the situation. And, as this conception of humility highlights, the other person, the client here, is the one who determines what's important. I also really like the phrase in this definition, the ability to maintain. This is work. This takes ongoing effort. And then another key idea from the discussion of humility, and one missing from this particular definition, but otherwise present in Hook's work, is the sense of having or being open to an accurate sense of one's abilities and achievements. So in the cultural context, this is an opening to think about privilege, or more generally, to think about what beliefs, expectations, preconceptions, identities, etc., that one is bringing to an interaction oneself. And the third aspect, let me go back to the definition. It's only implied here is that the context itself is important. You see it here in the use of the word client. Cultural humility came out of the health professions and spread into social work, counseling, which is the field that Hook is working in, and education. And in each of those fields, there are inherent power imbalances, as there are in libraries, though in our contexts, they're often less clear-cut. But there are inherent power imbalances, and in order to achieve the best outcomes, to use the language from the medical professions, these need redress. And indeed, central to the idea of cultural humility from its earliest formulation by Tourbillon is, quote, lifelong commitment to redressing the power imbalances inherent in the physician-patient dynamic. So rephrasing this for the dynamics that we have in libraries, which are often even more complex than doctor-patient or doctor-nurse, the combination of these awarenesses of the context itself, self-reflection, openness to others, are a solid foundation for examining issues of privilege and structural inequities. So Laurie mentioned that it's hard to measure humility, and it's certainly hard to get at it directly. The problem of asking, do you consider yourself humble, is obvious. Right? And this can pose a problem for organizations that want to promote cultural humility. Organizations typically need to assess the effectiveness of their programs. I have a hard time imagining a cultural humility pre- and post-test. Are you more humble now? And while there are a number of efforts that are going on to develop measures of cultural humility, for example, Hook, whose definition we're using, asked the clients to rate their counselors on cultural humility. I think not being able to easily measure this is actually a strength. It's a feature, not a bug, as it properly emphasizes cultural humility as a practice or way of being rather than as a destination. So for trainers or others trying to help people develop cultural humility, this means a focus on suggestions for practice rather than metrics to meet. And as a quick aside, I found a study that measured cultural competence with a pre- and post-test and found that scores actually went down for nursing students who took part in a brief cultural immersion program. So their cultural competence scores went down when being exposed to another culture. So there's a lot to think about with that. But moving into the library arena, why do we think cultural competency, or rather cultural humility, is a better fit than cultural competency for libraries? So the idea of cultural competence as learning about how people of certain cultures interact, that can be very useful for situations when you're going into a group whose culture you aren't familiar with, knowing that people in that group do things or see things differently. Again, going back to in culture A, they bow, in culture B, they shake hands. That prevents you from making a lot of unnecessary gaffes, and maybe prevents you from poisoning some potential relationships before you understand what's going on. But most library contexts are almost the opposite of that. Individuals are coming into our space and interacting with us within the norms that we create, whether intentionally or not. And even if we were able to accurately assess the culture of each of our patrons, and I'm using culture to include the myriad of possible identities, ethnicity, gender, religion, etc., interacting with that culture, treating the culture as monolithic instead of with the individual, quickly crosses into stereotyping. And Tourbillon, in fact, in making the case for cultural humility, reported seeing this, ethnic stereotyping, in the health professions as an unintended consequence of cultural competence trainings. Cultural humility is also a good fit for the values of our profession, not in the sense of, we are but humble librarians, but in the sense of every book its reader, every reader their book. We value the ideal of the library as a space where everybody is welcome, where people can engage with ideas without judgment. We are practiced in the reference interview of listening to our patrons and letting them determine what is needed, even as we use our expertise to match their needs with our services and collections. it's natural to extend that other focus to be open to having our patrons and our colleagues decide the role and importance their culture, broadly defined, plays in any situation without judgment or defensiveness. In fact, it is critical to our success as institutions and as librarians, and is immensely rewarding to us as people. So okay, but don't cultural competency initiatives in libraries do some of this? Yes, often they do. But making the focus on the state of being, humility, rather than on mastery, competence, emphasizes that this is a practice rather than an achievement. Words matter, and we need to get away from the language of mastery. And we know we need to reflect on ourselves and on our institutions and commit to redressing the power imbalances that prevent our services from having the most impact. Having that reflection embedded into our way of being as culturally humble people and professionals is surely a good thing.
Okay, so this sounds terrific. But in a resistant moment, Sarah and I wondered, wait, do we as women of color really need to work on our humility? So is this something that we're trying to do to make ourselves even smaller and less threatening? So that we don't make others feel uncomfortable? What about the pride we feel and encourage others to feel when thinking about our culture and our identities?
So let's look at another OED definition, this time for pride. So a high, is especially an excessively high, oops, oh no.
Oh, apparently we're back to the...
We got a preview of the fabulous stuff.
So the definition of pride, a high, excessively high opinion of one's own worth or importance, which gives rise to a feeling or attitude of superiority over others, inordinate self-esteem. So this feels a little dated. So how about a more contemporary take on pride? And we can go to the awesome picture of the dog. A consciousness of what befits, is due to, or is worthy of oneself or one's position. Self-respect, self-esteem, a legitimate or healthy kind or degree. So this definition really speaks more to us, and we don't think this definition of pride is counter to having a humble attitude, especially thinking about our previous discussion of humility's defining characteristic of accuracy.
This dog's name is Samosa.
Yes, we love
in real life.
So consider people who at first seem to be similar, but vary widely as individuals. So you can't see us, but Lori and I are both Native. Probably our Ancestry.com results show we're about half Native, half other. And we are both light-skinned and many times often get mistaken for other races, including white. We are both librarians. So does this mean that if you get to know me, then you know something about Lori? So we definitely avoid making assumptions about other Native folks or anyone else. And interacting with people in a culturally humble way allows for acknowledging that intersectionality, recognizing the multiple identities that each individual embodies.
There it goes. Sorry, it just started advancing again. Here, it's back. Okay, the play button is back. Yay. Oh, the next one. Sorry. Oh, whoops, too far. And finally, when we think of marginalized groups, it's likely that a focus on accuracy, it's likely that a focus on accuracy means that we are trending positive. I remember first learning about actual history in college and feeling a great sense of relief as I slowly began to understand that what I had been taught in high school was a pack of lies. More accurate knowledge filled me with a sense of pride in my own history. Mainstream culture may have taught some of us to internalize dominant narratives that are inaccurate and harmful. Humility encourages us to seek accuracy in as much as that's possible, and that's a good thing. So, what does cultural humility look like in practice? You have probably heard recent news about the city of New Orleans removing several monuments celebrating prominent Confederates. This effort took 2 years of effort by a lot of folks, from the moment that Mayor Landrieu first announced his intention to do so. This is a picture of the final monument removed, a statue of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. In a remarkable speech given on the occasion of this final removal, Mayor Landrieu spoke candidly and movingly of reasons for the removals. He described some of the history of New Orleans, including its history as a major port in the slave trade. He asked why there are no slave ship monuments, no prominent markers on public land to remember the lynchings or the slave blocks, which he goes on to describe as a lie by omission. The monuments in question purposefully celebrate a fictional sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, and the terror that it actually stood for. Landrieu's speech is especially notable because of his discussion of his personal journey. It contains other markers for cultural humility. For one, he describes listening, which might be the most important element of cultural humility in action. He listens to the stories of those impacted by these monuments. How can African American parents explain them to their children? Landrieu points out that though the motivations for his actions are clear to him now, he spent many years not even noticing the monuments. He then asserts, "So I am not judging anybody. We all take our own journey on race." In another moment, he celebrates the gift New Orleans gives to the world, saying, "We radiate beauty and grace in our food, in our music, in our architecture, in our joy of life, in our celebration of death, in everything we do." This appreciative reflection is inclusive and joyful, and another marker of cultural humility. Mayor Landrieu also quotes an example given by Obama on the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. This museum contains a stone that was once used as a slave auction block. And Obama said, "Consider what this artifact tells us about history. On a stone where day after day, for years, men and women bound and bought and sold and bid like cattle on a stone worn down by the tragedy of over 1,000 bare feet. For a long time, the only thing we considered important, the singular thing we once chose to commemorate as history with a plaque, were the unmemorable speeches of 2 powerful men." Both of these leaders, Landrieu and Obama, are speaking of stories, unheard stories. This can also be seen as an example of seeking accuracy in our history and ourselves, a prominent feature of humility. And I'll wrap up our presentation with Evan Adams, who you may recognize as an actor from the movie Smoke Signals. He is now a doctor and the Chief Medical Officer of the First Nations Health Authority in British Columbia. The First Nations Health Authority has undertaken an initiative around cultural humility, and one of the visible results is these public pledges by the folks who work there. These individuals are making commitments to celebrate, to participate, to remain aware, to listen, to stay curious. So we leave you with his amazing grin, because in the end, cultural humility is also about recognizing the joy and beauty of diversity and our work on equity and inclusion. Image credits, lots of image credits. So thank you for attending our webinar, and now we open it up for questions, Q&A.
Thank you for your patience with the slides.
Right, what's a webinar without some technical difficulties? Oh, thank you. And Kimberly, we want to see your dog.
And by the way, that dog is none of our dogs.
No, it's not our dog. We only wish.
Mine is not that fancy.
Oh yeah, so the authors, everybody that we mentioned, we have a handout that we'll put the link in the chat box for, and those give the citations to all of the articles that we mentioned, as well as just kind of an overview of what we're talking about again.
Yes.
And some further reading.
And our contact information. There's the link.
I believe so.
Let's see.
Oh, how are libraries?
To express cultural humility in hiring and
salaries.
That's a great question.
Thanks, Robin, for the question.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the the issue that we're kind of exploring now as we're looking at what's been done and what's being developed in cultural humility is how to actually implement it. And that's something that, I mean, we came into this just interested in the concept and exploring it really just conceptually. We are now at the UNM libraries going through a strategic planning process and are trying to think, how could we actually implement this here? I don't think we'd actually gotten to the point of thinking about it in terms of hiring and salaries.
Yeah.
So if you or anyone else has ideas to put in the chat, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's a good point, yeah.
So thanks about the point about stating our ethnicities.
Okay. Well, thanks for the nice comment, everyone. And we are still just, we've been reading and we get interested and we're trying to figure how this would, in real life, in libraries, how does this look and how can we think about it?
Yeah, and online settings are actually really interesting because you don't get the clues, particularly if you're doing chat reference or something like that. In some ways it's interesting because it makes it very explicit that the person you're working with has to share what they think is important.
Yeah.
On the other hand, that's putting a lot of burden on them. So that's actually really interesting. I'm going to note that down as something to look into because I don't have an answer for that either.
Examples where library workers can show cultural humility in 2-minute interactions. Oh.
Well, right, and I think this is, essentially extending what we do in the reference interview. It's really about listening and being open, but also sort of, I think in the reference interview, we're often listening for certain types of information, and we aren't necessarily listening for clues, stories or clues that would tell us, that some aspect of their identity is relevant to our interaction. And so I think making an effort to listen for those sorts of things and not to make assumptions necessarily, right? So we do a lot of online chat. When somebody starts chatting, it's easy for us to make assumptions about, is this an undergraduate student and what does that mean? And trying to avoid making those assumptions and letting the patron tell us who they are.
I also think,
can you read the questions you're answering? Okay, yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, we can
Sorry.
do that. Yeah. Are there any examples where library workers can show cultural humility in 2-minute interactions? That's the one that David was just talking about. I also feel like we can just take a second to pause before we start to answer a question because we think we've heard it a lot of times from various people.
Sure.
I know that I myself have to constantly remind myself to stop and wait and ask another question before I start assuming that I know already what they're asking me.
Yes, that's true.
Can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? I think so. I think that would be old.
I think with the link, the slides would be there, or you want a separate?
We can include a link on the handout, actually.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, we can add that, Kimberly.
What do you think about the ways? Oh, there was another question. Is navigating differences in values between cultures the hard part of this? Do I have to give up my values to be humble?
So no, you shouldn't have to give up your values. But I think, that's a really interesting way of asking that question. Because I see what you're asking, but the way you're phrasing it is making me think a lot.
Yes.
Because you shouldn't have to give up your values, right? But you do get into that question. And when I tried to phrase the fundamental problem as my norms aren't the only norms, and that doesn't mean any of them are wrong, that also doesn't mean that all of them are right. And so I guess being open to the possibility as you're listening to other people of reassessing your values and your, what you're bringing in, what baggage the wiener dog is carrying to the airport. To remember that slide, totally showed up. Right. So being open to being wrong, I think, is important. But I don't think you have to start from the perspective of, wow, I'm going to have to give up my values and accept whoever I'm listening's to values. I don't think that's what we want to talk about.
So there's a question, what do you think about the ways that cultural competence training is still so little done and or required in libraries? I think it's hard.
It's difficult. And we actually presented the bulk of this at the National Diversity in Libraries Conference. And as we were reworking this, how the world has changed since August 2016. Right. So you're right, that is still a problem, but I will say what I heard from other awesome presenters at the conference too was the problems with the diversity training and issues of cultural taxation that is a lot of times people of color that have to do these trainings or are asked to speak about these things, but it's not always a safe environment among colleagues. So it's difficult, and that's still something that, like David said, we asked about including some of these ideas as a concept within our own strategic planning, but not in specific, like, we want to do X, Y, Z, because we don't quite know how to get there. But it's difficult. But it still gets at, I think, again, our library value of every book, its reader getting to those individuals and helping, but I don't know. The diversity training, I don't know if anybody has other thoughts.
Well, and we actually had another slide that we took out that was related to the notion of diversity training. And I don't know, you may not have noticed, but in our slide on the diversity training, it's a group of all white people sitting at a table. And we had another slide that we had put in that was showing a woman of color in a live fire exercise, like crawling under that barbed wire.
Yeah.
And I feel like sometimes as people of color or as any kind of identity that you're dealing with when you talk about these kinds of trainings, it can feel like that. And so I personally, it can feel like you're on stage, and especially because librarians tend to work in majority white organizations, all the kinds of majority organizations that embody the dominant culture, it's difficult to do this kind of stuff and stay sensitive and have it be successful. And these are difficult conversations. Yeah. So,
and Naomi, thank you for bringing up disability.
Yes.
That's definitely very important as well.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm moving through the chat.
Right, but
This is a question.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
That was the one right after that. Well, it was after this one. You mentioned that the original article culture really affected each of you in a different way. Can you elaborate on that?
So, for me, so how I got into cultural humility, interestingly, I was doing some work for another organization. The board of directors noticed that the board of directors was very white, and a lot of people using the organization were very white, and somebody well-intentioned suggested, oh, we need to do diversity training. And the one woman of color who was on the board said, oh, please, no more diversity training. And that actually got us into a discussion of why that was her reaction, and that's how it got into cultural humility.
Yes.
And it really resonated for me, because for me the thing that was important was the recognition of well, two things. One was the recognition of the context being important. I had spent, I lived about 8 years on Navajo Nation, and one of the things that you learn either ahead of time or when you get there is Navajo handshakes are very different from the kind of handshakes, the firm handshake that I was raised with. And so I've actually seen this in cultural competence trainings, this example of the Navajo handshake, because you come in, if you have my background and you give a firm handshake and you break somebody's hand, and of course the people who are shaking my hand, I'm not the first white person whose hand they are shaking. And they have learned that white people have, or certain white people have very firm handshakes. And so they're prepared for that and they give a firm handshake. And so then my hand gets broken. And so there's this negotiation of the context, right? I mean, this is kind of a silly example, but it's this negotiation of the context of who are you, who am I, where are we, what are we doing here, that I felt like a lot of the cultural competency things missed. And then the other side was moving to Albuquerque. I got a job in the public library, and my very first day in the public library, my first reference shift, a friend of mine or somebody that I knew from the Navajo Nation who happened to be in the library came up and said hi, and we chatted for a little bit. And so talking to my colleague about, oh yeah, we knew each other from this, I was just living on the Navajo Nation, and she said, oh, wow, we really don't get a lot of Navajos in this library. And I looked around, and it was about a quarter Navajos. And so recognizing that, it's really hard for us in the library to know who are our patrons when they come in. It's not like going to some place where you are the outsider. It's having people from an infinite possible collection of identities coming in and interacting with us. So that's kind of why it resonated for me.
So this is Lori, and I guess for me, this seemed to solve a little bit of a puzzle and put a name on something that I hadn't previously really named, and it's this sense of why do some people get it? And I felt like I had had colleagues in the past who were just so wonderful to interact with, who were such wonderful allies, and when I was introduced to this cultural humility concept, it just made sense of how they were approaching the world. And so it solved this little puzzle that had always been in my head about, well, how do these people get there? And then the other thing that I'll mention is that in my other hat, I'm the Learning Services Coordinator, which basically means I'm the instruction coordinator here. And I'm also, my research area is threshold concepts for information literacy. And cultural humility seemed like a threshold concept to me. And I'm very hesitant to say that because threshold concepts kind of have a bad rap or name, but it felt like that to me. It felt like something that was transformative and shifted the way you saw the world, and that was very difficult. But there's something very simplifying about threshold concepts to me. They help make sense of something in a way that a big list of competencies I struggle with. So, Sarah?
Oh, and I guess I will say that the idea resonated with me, particularly thinking about helping someone from my own community, from Zuni Pueblo, who was a student here at UNM, but he was also elder to me. He has been in tribal government in past roles, so he's a person that I respect, but also then that changed our whole interaction because I, to show that respect, how do I try to figure out what he needs, but also it's not about me sort of like offering these things because his role is I should really be listening to what he wants, but really it was very obvious because that's the role in the community. Me as a younger person than him would kind of let him guide the conversation, and so it was just thinking through all these things, and then when we reading the cultural humility literature, that really seemed to get at more of, it was very being aware of it's not about me trying to, this is what the library can do, and this is kind of where I can meet you. It's like, I really need to step back and listen to this person because, again, it's someone from my community. It's a small-ish community, 10,000 members, but still it was that interaction, and it just made sense to me in that particular way, but and helped me kind of think through some of those things. So that's just my one experience with it.
We have a question. I wonder if cultural humility wouldn't be just as difficult to implement as cultural competence. It would be nice to see the ideas in conversation rather than one supplanting the other.
Yes.
Actually, I just gave myself away there when I said supplementing. especially when there's a lot of really strong work emerging right now. So
yes,
I do
agree.
I agree. Yes, we agree. We do think, I think probably the reason why we said it to some extent in opposition is the sense of really wanting to make clear that this is different. It doesn't mean that they can't work together
No,
really well.
not at all. And that the standards that the ACRL standards have a lot of those pieces of cultural humility within
Oh,
them,
yes. Yeah.
right? So
And-
it's not enough.
Yeah, and I think the cultural competence, I don't think you can actually be culturally competent without also having cultural humility, because otherwise you just get into the, oh, I know your culture. I have received training in how to interact with you, and it's going to be great. So yeah, I think definitely we don't need to replace one with the other, but that they are connected. The other question, there was a question in there about people who don't see color, right? And this is,
Yeah,
cultural humility. You
problem.
don't get to determine that. I mean, I guess
Because
maybe,
it's not about you.
right. It's not about you, right? You've got to be open
Yes.
to what who the person you're interacting with is, and what's important about them.
But I agree. I've heard, not here, colleagues, other librarian colleagues say those words, and it made me preach.
Right.
Well, I don't know if we have time for
Yeah, I think we're
maybe done.
put these emphasize.
Thank you all for these thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. We
They give
appreciate
us
the conversation.
more
the
things to
questions.
think about.
Yeah, and I'm glad the chat's going to get recorded as well, because there are a lot of great comments in there.
We tried to get all of the questions. I don't
think we,
might have missed some somewhere.
yes.
And then if you have any particular questions for us, feel free to email us. Our contact information is in the handout that we linked to, and on our first slide, so when you have the recording.
And we'll put a link to the PowerPoint so that you
Yes.
a place where you can download it
Yes.
in our handout as well.
Well, thank you everyone for
Thank
coming
you, everyone.
and the thoughts, and yes, I'm glad it was hopefully interesting. Thank you all. Should we? And thanks to Oglos folks again, and Samantha and John and everybody.
Yes, thanks
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you. We appreciate it.